China wants to buy more oil from Alberta, and according to Alberta's own investment chief, with all the uncertainty in the world, especially the uncertainty created by our friends down south, China prefers to work with Alberta because we are stable, reliable, and high quality. That statement lands like a geopolitical flare. It signals a shift larger than a simple trade promotion. It shows a Canada that is no longer boxed into a one-customer future, and an Alberta that is rapidly stepping into a global energy market reshaped by disruption. Today, we break down why China is moving toward Alberta oil, why Canada suddenly has leverage it hasn't enjoyed in decades, and why this moment is quietly undermining the assumptions Washington has held about North American energy for half a century.
And with all of the uncertainty that currently resides in the world, especially the uncertainty being created by our friends down south, dealing with a reliable Alberta, which has predictable products, high quality, is something that they want to continue to build on and continue to work on. Most people in Alberta probably know that the Chinese invest largely in our economy, and in oil and gas, their investment is well over $60 billion, which represents almost 50% of all the money that China invests in Canada. So certainly an important trade and investment partner for us.
A Canadian trade mission involving federal officials and provincial leaders from Saskatchewan and Alberta just returned from China with results that very few analysts predicted. China agreed to ease tariffs on Canadian agriculture, especially canola. Canada, in return, offered structured openings for Chinese electric vehicles. More importantly, a series of private meetings set the stage for new Chinese investment tours in February, targeting energy, petrochemicals, agriculture, and even tourism infrastructure inside Alberta. But the most striking moment came from Rick Christjones, the CEO of Invest Alberta. He revealed that China has already become the largest buyer of oil shipped through the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline, grabbing a commercial position that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. He added that China wants even more Alberta crude as it diversifies away from politically volatile suppliers and adapts to disruptions created by U.S. strategic decisions. This is happening at a time when Canada is pursuing a more independent foreign economic strategy under Prime Minister Mark Carney, while President Donald Trump continues applying unpredictable tariff pressure across North America. With Beijing searching for reliable long-term suppliers, Alberta suddenly finds itself in the middle of a geopolitical realignment it did not initiate, but stands ready to benefit from.
For decades, the U.S. held a privileged position over Canadian crude. Most Alberta oil flowed south through infrastructure designed to serve American refiners, giving Washington a natural form of leverage. When political tensions rose, the U.S. knew Canada had limited alternatives. That era is ending. With the Trans Mountain Expansion now moving barrels to the Pacific, Canada finally has a functioning route to Asian buyers. China becoming its top offshore buyer dramatically reduces the U.S.'s structural advantage. Suddenly, Canada has choices, and in international politics, the ability to choose is the foundation of sovereignty. Nothing irritates Washington more than losing leverage it once assumed was permanent. But Canada's new export flexibility is not an act of defiance. It's a correction to decades of one-sided dependency. Alberta is signaling that its resources are global commodities, not regional obligations, and that the U.S. cannot expect the deference that came from being the only viable customer. Beijing's interest in Alberta oil is not emotional, ideological, or symbolic. It's practical. China wants suppliers who are consistent, legally stable, and insulated from abrupt foreign policy swings. Canada meets all three criteria. This shift did not happen in isolation. China has reduced purchases of U.S. crude, partly because American energy exports fluctuate with political cycles. When a single White House announcement can trigger price jolts or revise export priorities, long-term planning becomes difficult. Canada, by contrast, offers predictability. The rule of law prevents sudden export bans, the political system avoids disruptive shocks, and Alberta's production capacity has proven resilient through multiple global crises. China is not choosing Canada as a geopolitical partner. It is choosing Canada as a hedge against volatility, against tariffs, and against the weaponization of supply chains. And that calculus, ironically, gives Canada room to maneuver even as the U.S. tries to tighten its strategic hold over North America. The quote from Alberta's investment head, blaming uncertainty created by our friends down south, is remarkable because of how casually it was delivered. Canadian officials usually avoid provoking Washington, but this time the criticism was direct and unfiltered. It reflects a broader truth.
Provinces and industries are tired of adjusting their entire export strategy every time Washington shifts its political mood. Alberta is no longer willing to build its economic future around the instability of U.S. domestic politics. Instead, it is diversifying, not because it wants to antagonize the United States, but because staying dependent on a single customer is now considered a strategic liability. And that shift, subtle, rational, and economically justified, carries enormous consequences for the balance of power in North America.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it clear that Canada intends to double its non-US exports over the next decade and rebuild an industrial base that can withstand geopolitical shocks. The Alberta-China dynamic fits seamlessly into that agenda. It is not a pivot away from the US, but rather an expansion toward a multipolar trade posture. Carney's message is simple. Canada will not allow its prosperity to hinge on decisions made in Washington. By opening new markets, strengthening Asia ties, and rebuilding domestic capacity, Canada is asserting an economic autonomy it hasn't exercised since the early post-war years. What makes this moment potent is that Alberta, often framed as the province most culturally aligned with the United States, is now leading the diversification effort. When Alberta begins embracing non-US markets, the entire narrative of Canadian dependency starts to unravel.
The U.S. has not issued a formal response, but American officials understand exactly what is happening. China's emergence as a major buyer of Canadian crude, Alberta's public criticism of U.S. unpredictability, and the growing presence of Asian investment capital all weaken Washington's traditional bargaining position as Canada enters the 2026 USMCA review. Trump's team has relied on energy leverage to pressure allies into trade concessions. But if Canada can sell its oil anywhere, that tool loses its edge. And without that tool, Washington loses a significant portion of its negotiating power. China's interest in Alberta oil is not just a trade story. It reveals a structural shift in global energy politics and a broader Canadian awakening. Alberta is expanding its customer base. China is diversifying its supply lines. And Canada, for the first time in decades, has the ability to shape its own energy future without waiting for American approval. The bigger question moving forward is this. As Canada gains leverage, independence, and global reach, how will Washington react? And what happens when a traditionally quiet northern partner begins playing the energy game on its own terms?
I look forward to speaking to the President soon, but I don't have a burning issue to speak with the President about right now. When America wants to come back and have the discussions on the trade side, we will have those discussions.
Canada just delivered one of its clearest signals in years. Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's approval, and it certainly isn't rushing to repair a relationship that President Trump himself froze. When Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked whether he had any burning issue to raise with Trump, he didn't hesitate. I don't have a burning issue to speak with the president about right now. And with Trump skipping the G20 altogether, Canada suddenly stepped into a moment of rare leverage on the world stage.
This week, Mark Carney arrived in Johannesburg for the G20 summit, a gathering of economies that collectively represent most of the world's population and global output. One chair, however, remained empty. President Donald Trump boycotted the event entirely, repeating inflammatory claims about South Africa and declaring that he would not represent the United States at what he called a disgraceful summit. His absence immediately reshaped the tone and structure of the meetings. For Canada, the timing was remarkable. Carney had just come from a major investment push in the United Arab Emirates, where the UAE pledged more than $90 billion toward Canadian projects, including over $20 billion earmarked for specific initiatives tied to clean energy, critical minerals, aviation, and high-value manufacturing. Unlike traditional announcements, this one carried real weight because the projects are aligned with Canada's long-term economic strategy and are designed to operate independently of U.S. policy volatility. Fresh off that success, Carney entered the G20 with a full slate of bilateral and multilateral engagements. Without Donald Trump's dominating presence, world leaders from Europe, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific were unusually eager to speak with Ottawa. Carney met with France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the European Union's leadership,
Norway, South Korea, Indonesia, and India, an unusually broad diplomatic sweep in such a short period. Observers noted an immediate shift. With Washington absent, Canada found itself holding one of the clearest voices among Western democracies. Carney's remark about having no burning issue with Trump is more than a casual comment. It captures a deeper shift in how Canada sees the bilateral relationship. For decades, Canadian governments operated under an unwritten rule. When Washington moved, Ottawa reacted. This pattern continued even when the United States initiated the conflict, whether through tariffs, accusations, or sudden diplomatic freezes. But Carney's approach breaks that tradition. Rather than chasing Washington to resume talks, he made clear that Canada has been busy advancing its own agenda, structuring a federal budget aimed at catalyzing more than $1 trillion in long-term investment, launching new trade initiatives, restoring ties with Asian partners, and strengthening Canada's position in European and Indo-Pacific security discussions. Ottawa's message is unmistakable. Canada will re-engage with the United States when it is strategically appropriate, not when pressured or provoked. This shift was cemented earlier in the fall when the U.S. abruptly suspended trade discussions after reacting to a political advertisement in Ontario. The suspension, combined with Trump's aggressive tariff schedule of 10 to 100% on imports from allies, forced Canada to rethink its dependence on U.S. market access. Carney's strategy emerged from that moment, a strategy built on diversification, resilience, and a clear refusal to be cornered by American political cycles.
Carney's now taking his pitch to other countries on the sidelines of the G20. Trump not being there removes a big center of attention.
If part of the goal for Mark Carney at this summit is to have meetings with key countries that Canada is trying to deepen its trade partnerships with, like South Korea, like Indonesia, India, and others, then Trump's absence may, in some ways, actually create some space for that.
Trump's absence from the G20 created a vacuum of attention and authority, and Canada used it effectively. For years, G20 gatherings have revolved around U.S. participation, often overshadowing smaller nations regardless of the strength of their proposals. But with the United States voluntarily pulling itself out of the room, leaders sought anchor points elsewhere. Canada became one of those anchors. The discussions Carney held on the sidelines centered on energy security, critical mineral supply chains, digital infrastructure, Arctic cooperation, and long-term transition financing. Many of these topics are areas where Canada holds natural advantages: a clean electricity grid, vast deposits of nickel, copper, cobalt, and rare minerals, and a geopolitical position that links the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Atlantic. These are not theoretical strengths. They are strengths countries like Germany, South Korea, and India urgently need to secure for the next several decades. Carney's meetings also reflected a shift in tone from Canada itself. There was no apologetic posture, no waiting for cues from Washington, and no effort to soften Canada's growing network of alliances to avoid upsetting the U.S. Instead, the Prime Minister presented Canada as a country stepping into a world where stability and reliability matter more than ever, especially as global economies prepare for long-term transition and geopolitical uncertainty.
The backdrop to all of this is a United States that increasingly isolates itself. In the past year, the Trump administration has escalated conflicts with Europe over tariffs, clashed repeatedly with China, reopened disputes with Mexico, and used trade tools that disrupt not only adversaries but long-standing allies. The decision to boycott the G20 added another layer of unpredictability, leaving Washington absent from critical conversations on global coordination at a time when major economies are seeking stability more than ever. The impact is real. European and Asian partners are repositioning themselves, not because they want to abandon the United States, but because they need dependable pathways for trade and security. Canada fits neatly into that role. Ottawa is not an ideological outlier. It is not unreliable. And unlike many countries, its domestic political climate has not become a source of constant international uncertainty. This dynamic strengthens Canada's leverage. When Washington chooses unpredictability, Ottawa becomes more attractive, not only as a partner, but as a mediator, a bridge, and in certain domains, even a leader.
Beyond trade deals and diplomacy, Carney's stance taps into something deeper, a renewed sense of national identity.
For years, Canadians have watched political instability in the United States with concern. Trump's tariff escalations added pressure at home. But instead of shrinking, Canada appears to be growing more confident. The UAE's investment package reinforces this trend. The G20 meetings amplify it. And the government's broader strategy to double non-U.S. exports within a decade shows long-term commitment rather than short-term optics. Canada is not turning its back on the United States, but it is building a future that no longer depends on American alignment.
This week's events mark a turning point. Canada is shifting from a reactive player in North American politics to an independent force with a global network of partners. Carney's calm insistence that there is no burning issue to raise with Trump symbolizes more than diplomatic distance. It symbolizes strategic confidence. Trump's absence from the G20 simply accelerated the transformation. Without Washington at the table, Canada stepped into a leadership role naturally, backed by new investment, strengthened alliances, and a steadily expanding global strategy. The real question now is whether the United States will eventually recognize the shift, or whether Canada's new direction will permanently reshape the balance of influence on this continent.
Canadians have become united in the face of the fundamental change in U.S. trade policy. That's their choice. Yesterday, Canada and the UAE signed, finally, a Foreign Investment Promotion and Partnership Agreement, or FIPA. This will unlock tens of billions of dollars in investment between our two countries. And for Canadians, it's an opportunity to expand for our engineering firms, our construction companies, our aerospace sector, our agri-food, seafood producers, our AI firms.
Canada has just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the country is stepping into a new global role. In Abu Dhabi, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a sweeping $115 billion investment plan that reads less like a routine economic announcement and more like a declaration of national confidence. For years, Canada played cautiously on the global stage, especially when dealing with the United States. But this time, Carney made something unmistakably clear. Canada is done waiting for Washington's permission. The country is building its future on its own terms with partners who actually want to build.
At the Canada-UAE Investment Summit, Carney addressed a room full of investors, ministers, CEOs, and Emirati leaders. It was the kind of audience that signals seriousness, people who move capital, shape energy markets, and influence the technological future. Carney walked them through what Canada has already launched. In the span of just a few months, his government has announced more than $10 billion worth of nation-building projects. These include a new deepwater port project in Montreal, expanded energy corridors linking provinces, critical mineral highways running from mines to global markets, and major clean electricity expansions meant to double Canada's already 80% clean grid. But the investment tally was only the surface. What mattered even more was the partnership that Carney came to cement. Canada and the UAE signed a long-awaited Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, unlocking tens of billions in future deals. Carney and the UAE leadership also agreed to begin negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, a modern trade deal designed to strip away tariffs, open new markets, and anchor long-term supply chains between the two economies. Carney underscored how deeply aligned the two countries already are. Both are energy superpowers. Both sit at the intersection of global trade routes. Both want to lead the AI, digital infrastructure, and clean technology revolutions that will define this century. And both are willing to invest real capital to make it happen. Carney spoke with striking bluntness when he said that Canadians have become united in the face of fundamental changes in U.S. trade policy. It wasn't rhetoric, it was the practical reality facing the country. Under President Donald Trump's second term, the U.S. has returned to a hardline protectionist approach, sweeping tariffs, aggressive reshoring demands, and policy shifts that disrupt established supply chains. Reuters reporting through 2025 confirms that Canadian exporters have been diversifying because of instability, and the Bank of Canada has even lowered growth forecasts due to U.S. trade uncertainty. Carney's speech captured a turning point that has been building quietly for years. Canada no longer treats Washington's decisions as the gravitational center of its economy. Instead, it is preparing for a future where the U.S. is just one partner among many. This shift isn't anti-American, it's pro-Canadian, and that distinction matters. Canada's strategy stretches far beyond this summit. Carney outlined an economic map that now runs through Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, a multi-engine model designed to eliminate dependence on any single market. Canada has already finalized an economic partnership with Indonesia and is deep in negotiations with Thailand and the Philippines, with a full ASEAN deal expected next year. Even long-frozen relationships with India and China are reopening, highlighted by Carney's turning point meeting with Xi Jinping at APEC. All of this reinforces a simple point. Canada is positioning itself at the center of several global networks, not just North America. That shift matters as the 2026 USMCA review approaches, giving Ottawa leverage it hasn't had in decades.
A standout moment in Carney's speech was his praise for the UAE's clean energy achievements. Masdar's 70-gigawatt clean power portfolio, including the world's largest solar plus battery project, is redefining what renewable baseload looks like. Carney linked this directly to Canada's ambitions, a grid already among the world's cleanest and a plan to double capacity within a decade. This puts Canada and the UAE on the same forward trajectory, while the United States, under Trump, moves in the opposite direction by rolling back clean energy incentives and freezing offshore wind development. As U.S. momentum slows, Canada and the UAE are building the industrial ecosystem of the future.
Carney highlighted another crucial point. A billion-dollar agreement now close to finalization that will expand critical minerals processing capacity inside Canada. This is on top of the federal government's new $2 billion Minerals Sovereign Fund and more than $10 billion earmarked for mines-to-port infrastructure. For the world's clean tech economy, this is not a side story, it's a core story. Reuters and AP coverage consistently note that the United States remains heavily dependent on Chinese minerals because it lacks processing facilities at home. Trump's tariffs on Canadian metals have only added to U.S. supply instability. Canada is seizing that vacuum, partnering with nations like the UAE that need secure access to these minerals. In global terms, this positions Canada as the backbone of the Western critical minerals supply chain, something the United States cannot replicate quickly under current policies.
Carney ended his speech by describing Canada as a AAA-rated, fiscally disciplined, stable democracy with some of the strongest institutions in the world. But it wasn't bragging, it was positioning. Canada is making itself the safe, predictable anchor in a volatile global economy. The fact that Canadian pension funds holding more than $2 trillion in assets are heading to the UAE early next year is a signal of intent. This is a two-way relationship built on scale, credibility, and ambition. It is not symbolic diplomacy. It is structural realignment. Canada is no longer knocking on doors asking to participate. It is setting the table and inviting the world to come to it.
Carney's $115 billion plan is more than a domestic investment package. It is the blueprint of a new global posture. Canada is stepping into a world where partnerships define power, where clean energy leadership determines competitiveness, and where countries thrive not by clinging to old alliances, but by building new ones. For decades, Canada's economic story was almost exclusively tied to the United States. Today, that story is being rewritten. The UAE is one pillar, ASEAN is another, East Asia is a rising engine, and the US, while still critical, is no longer the only destination. The question now is how quickly Canada can turn this moment into momentum, and whether the United States is ready to accept that Canada no longer lives in its shadow.
It is the only moment of Mark Carney's day that the UAE is allowing Canadian media to film as it restricts access. Behind closed doors before that, Carney met with the UAE's president and signed a new investment agreement.
It's part of his ongoing mission to reduce Canada's economic reliance on the United States.
Canada just made one of its boldest economic moves in years, and it happened far from Washington's shadow. Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed a major investment agreement with the President of the United Arab Emirates, opening the door to a new era of trade, capital flows, and strategic partnerships. And make no mistake, this is not just diplomacy. It is Canada declaring to the world that it will no longer allow Donald Trump's trade war to define its future. Carney arrived in Abu Dhabi this week with a clear purpose: to secure new partners as Canada accelerates its plan to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. The visit included a tightly controlled tour of the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque, the only moment UAE officials allowed cameras to capture. Behind closed doors, however, real business was happening. Carney met privately with UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Together, they signed a new bilateral investment agreement, a treaty designed to protect and encourage foreign direct investment between the two countries. At the same time, both sides formally launched talks toward a Canada-UAE free trade agreement, something that no Canadian government had seriously pursued with the Gulf states until now. Carney's office says the pact will open doors for Canadian aerospace firms, engineering companies, agri-food exporters, and seafood producers. In return, the UAE signaled interest in investing in Canadian ports, mines, liquefied natural gas, critical minerals, and infrastructure, sectors Canada sees as essential for its long-term security and global competitiveness. The backdrop is undeniable. Donald Trump's second-term tariff campaign has driven Canadian exporters into a corner, with 10 to 100% U.S. border taxes hitting autos, steel, aluminum, and even food products. Reuters recently reported that Canada's exports to the U.S. have already dropped nearly 10 percentage points since 2024, the steepest decline in decades. Carney's response has been consistent: diversify or be dominated. As former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, now part of Carney's business delegation, told reporters, there's a bigger world out there than just the United States. And according to him, none of these agreements happen unless the Prime Minister personally leads the charge. For nearly 40 years, Canada has lived with a fundamental economic vulnerability. More than 75% of its exports flowed into a single market, the United States. When relations were stable, that dependency created comfort. But under Trump's renewed protectionism, it has turned into a strategic liability. The new UAE agreement is part of a broader Carney doctrine: build a global trade network that prevents any future American administration from holding Canada's economy hostage. Over the past 6 months, Carney has aggressively pushed deals across Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and now the Middle East. He met leaders in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia. He initiated a major ASEAN trade push. And last month, he announced internal reforms to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers by mid-2026, a structural fix long demanded by Canadian businesses to compete with U.S. scale advantages. Each move chips away at the old assumption that Canada must live at the mercy of American moods.
The UAE is not just another trading partner. It is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth investors, a country with deep capital surpluses and a hunger for stable democratic markets. For them, Canada is a perfect match: resource-rich, politically stable, and increasingly aligned with global clean energy demand. A bilateral investment treaty gives UAE investors the certainty they need to commit billions. For Canada, this money could accelerate LNG export terminals, northern deepwater ports, critical mineral extraction, and Arctic infrastructure, all areas where U.S. politics have slowed progress. According to reports in regional Gulf media, UAE officials have already signaled interest in large-scale investment in Canadian energy corridors and technology hubs. And unlike the U.S., the UAE is not demanding tariff concessions or political favors in return.
The timing is not accidental. Trump's second-term tariffs have created bottlenecks in North American supply chains, discouraged U.S. investment in Canada, and pushed firms like Stellantis and GM to relocate production south of the border. This has sparked backlash in Ottawa, where Carney's government now openly admits that dependence on the U.S. is no longer sustainable. Internationally, analysts are noting a trend. Canada is being pulled into a more multipolar trade world, where the U.S. is no longer the automatic center of gravity. The UAE deal reinforces that shift. It signals that Canada can attract partners even while the U.S. turns inward. It gives Canada new bargaining power in any future USMCA renegotiation. And it warns Washington that the era of unquestioned Canadian alignment may be ending. Trump's administration, meanwhile, has struggled to respond. While U.S. officials accuse allies of disloyal trade behavior, the reality is that Canada is reacting to U.S. aggression, not initiating it. Trump's tariffs created this diversification wave. Now he must live with the consequences.
There are, of course, risks. The UAE faces international scrutiny over allegations involving Sudan's conflict, though the UAE strongly denies involvement. Carney raised regional security concerns during the meeting, but his office did not disclose specifics. Still, the geopolitical complexity does not erase the strategic logic. Canada must expand its economic alliances at a moment when the U.S. is unpredictable, China is slowing economically, and Europe is overextended. The Middle East, especially the Gulf, offers something rare: capital, demand, and a willingness to engage without ideological baggage.
Canada's investment pact with the UAE is more than a trade story. It is a statement of intent. It tells the world that Canada is stepping into a new era of strategic confidence, willing to build alliances on its own terms, and determined to escape the gravitational pull of American politics. The question now is simple: will this be the beginning of a global Canadian commercial renaissance, or the first step into a more competitive, multipolar future where every partnership carries new risks? Viewers, what's your take? Is Canada finally standing tall on the global stage?